We're now in part two of our lecture on the American Revolution. So, part C here, choosing sides. As the American Revolution is starting, we've declared our independence. People in the American colonies have to decide if they're going to be in support of the revolution. And I had said last time, somewhere between 20 to 33% of the colonists chose the side of the Tories or the Loyalists. The other third, more or less, chose the Patriot side, and then the middle third just wanted to avoid the whole thing completely, didn't choose one side or the other. And so let's talk about the people who decide to stay loyal to the king. They're called Loyalists or Tories. Who are they? So one of the groups that we see that will tend to stay loyal are people that were employed by the king for obvious reasons, right? They're getting their money from the king. They get their status and privilege from serving the king. So here we have a picture of Thomas Hutchinson. He's the governor of Massachusetts. But people like him would remain loyal, right? Because he is a royal governor. The king gets to choose him. He gets to enforce the king's will. That gives him more status and privilege. So of course he doesn't want to break away and lose his power. Another one is older people tended to be supporters of the king. You know, they've grown their whole life being an English subject, and they just don't understand why people would want to change that. Change is unsettling for people, and, you know, this is what I'm used to, and so why would I want to change? Next, Christians who are members of the king's church, the Anglican church, they see the king not just as their government leader, but as the leader of their church. And to go against the king would be to go against their church that they hold dear. The Anglican church is strongest in the South, so we will see a lot of loyalists and Tories in the southern colonies. Next, also in New York, we're going to see aristocrats, people that have a lot of money, sometimes merchants here. Now, typically merchants are patriots, but here in New York, it's a little bit different because New York is a major harbor. They haven't had as many problems with the British as the people in Boston Harbor have. And so, you know, they're major customers of the British and the English, and why would they want to tick off their customers and stop and mess with their business? So they tended to be aristocrats. They tend to be loyalists. Next, we have Quakers. The Society of Friends, they believe in nonviolence and they're pacifists, and so they think, why are we stirring up trouble? You know, peace is the way to go. And so there's a lot of pacifists or a lot of Quakers in Pennsylvania, and so that'll be a segment of the population that stays loyal. And then we also have some African American slaves who will remain, who will choose the British side. As the war is going on, the British need more help to win the war and to fight in their army. And so the British government issues a declaration that said if you're a slave and you run away from your owner, weakening patriot plantation owners if you lose your labor force. If you run away from your owner and you come to join the British Army, we'll make sure that when we win this thing, you get your freedom. And so we had some African Americans join the side of the king. Now, what about the other side, the Patriots? So Patriot is what we call somebody who's for the revolution. And so let's go through this. So on the left-hand side, we see liberals. And what I mean by liberal at this time is classical liberalism. Classical liberalism means that you believe that the government should be small and people's rights should be protected more than anything else. And they believe in the Enlightenment. And so at this point, they thought, well, of course I'm going to support the revolution. We're fighting against a big, powerful government. We're fighting for rights. And so people are liberal like Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, people that are Enlightenment thinkers. Next, wealthy Southern plantation owners. These people are loyalists for two reasons. Are patriots for two reasons. One, they really want to sell their tobacco or rice or whoever to whoever is the biggest bidder. So if I'm a tobacco plantation owner, like Thomas Jefferson, I want to be able to sell my tobacco to France or Spain or whoever gives me the highest price for my tobacco. In addition to that, a lot of plantation owners lived well beyond their means. They spent more money than they took in from their tobacco sales. They had these big plantation houses. They had chandeliers, wine, dresses for their wives and daughters, et cetera, et cetera. And so they were oftentimes heavily into debt to British merchants. And if we join the revolution and break away from England, we don't have to pay back our debts. And so there's a financial motive right there to join the revolution. Next, we see New Englanders. Now, this is a no-brainer because, New Englanders have been the most affected by the lead up to the revolution, right? The Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, the Boston Harbor Act, all of those things were hurting the economy and the people of New England. And so this is where we see the core of the Patriot cause. Next, Scotch-Irish, right? The Scotch-Irish, if you remember, if this is the coast of the colonies. When they first moved here, the Scotch-Irish moved all the way inland to be away from the English because the English killed them when they were in Scotland, and then when the Scots moved to Ireland, the English killed them there. So when the Scotch-Irish moved to America, they wanted to get as far away from the English as they could, and so they started living in the mountaintops of the colonies, the Appalachian Mountains. And so this is kind of these isolated people on the frontier. And they, more than anything else, are going to fight Native Americans because that's who lives there. And so when England passed the Proclamation of 1763 that drew a line down the mountains and said, you guys can't go there anymore, this really ticked off the Scotch-Irish. Nobody's going to tell me, especially not English, where to live. And so we see the Scotch-Irish have no love for the English anyway, and if America becomes a country, well, we don't have anybody telling us not to go west. And so we see the Scotch-Irish are going to join. Next, we see farmers are going to join the revolution because farmers want to be able, especially farmers in the middle colonies, they want to be able to sell their cereal crops to the highest bidder as well. It doesn't have to be an English colony or a part of the English Empire. Maybe we want to sell to the Dutch or the Spanish. And then artisans. Artisans have been hampered in their ability to make more money because of the Navigation Acts, right? The Navigation Act says that the colonies cannot produce anything at a big level. And the artisans, what if you want to grow your business? What if you want to make a lot more shoes, or if you want to make a lot more clothes or whatever? Well, you can't do it because there's limits on how big your business can get because of England's laws. So if we become independent, well, now there's no more restrictions. I can do what I want and make more money. And so we see artisans, lower class farmers, Scotch-Irish, New Englanders, all of these groups have either a social or an economic or a religious motive to be either on one side or the other. Next, women. Now, we've already talked about women supporting the revolution pre-revolution. We had said during the boycotts, women played a really important role in supporting the boycotts, making their own homespun, not buying things from the British, and it couldn't have really worked without them. And so women have now, as the revolution gets going, and we talk about this spirit of 76, all of these ideas about what the American Revolution is for, the idea that we're fighting for freedom, democracy, liberty. Well, if you're a woman living in a patriarchal, male-dominated society, and you start to hear all these ideas about freedom, democracy, equality, you're getting very excited, because maybe this revolution will give me freedom. Maybe it'll give me equality. Maybe I'll be able to vote, or I'll be able to hold property. And so we see women getting excited for the revolution for that reason. Also, we're seeing women that the government is now, people and leaders are starting to talk about this idea of Republican motherhood. That when the revolution is over, we're going to have democracy, right? Power to the people, spirit of 76. And if we're going to put the people in charge of the government, we got to make sure that these future voters are educated, are moral, they're going to be thoughtful, and of course, who has the most impact on young men who are going to be future voters? Their moms do. The moms traditionally teach them morality and decency. The moms are more religious on average than their fathers are in many instances, and so, yeah, if we're going to have a democracy, we better have women, moms, who teach their sons how to be good citizens from a very early age. And so the idea of Republican motherhood is the idea that we cannot have a future democracy if we don't honor and respect moms and tell them that we respect them, because we need them to do their job and raise good, virtuous sons who will grow up and vote and lead the republic one day. And so we will see that when the revolution is over, there's only one state that's going to give women the right to vote, and that's New Jersey. And then not too long they take it away. But all the other states, we don't give women equality, even though that's in the spirit of 76, but we do at least acknowledge their role as domestic homemakers and mothers. And this is more than they had before. Maybe before they were taken advantage of or ignored, but now we kind of put them on a pedestal and say our country's success rests on you. And for a lot of women, that felt good, right? This idea of Republican motherhood, that the republic is depending on me to be a good mom, to raise good sons, I feel honored. And so women got caught up in the spirit of 76. Here are some other ways that women supported the revolution. We've already talked about boycotts when the revolution was starting, right? And women making their own goods. But when the revolution goes on, men will leave to fight in the military, or they'll die. And so women have to step up and run businesses. And so, not just doing their regular job, which is full of taking care of the kids, cooking and cleaning, taking care of the house, but now they have to run the farm or they have to run the local business while their husband is away fighting. And this is a trend we see in almost every American war, right? And so women have a huge role to play in the revolution. So here we have this very famous quote. So this is Abigail Adams on the right. Her husband is John Adams, who is away at the Second Continental Congress trying to help lead the revolution through the Second Continental Congress and get people excited about it. And so she writes this kind of warning letter, tongue-in-cheek sort of, to her husband, saying to her husband who's in Congress, "Remember the ladies, John, and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power in the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation." So she's writing her husband, like, as we talk about freedom and democracy and liberty, don't forget to give women rights. Now, John kind of laughed it off. Haha, good one, Abigail. But she was serious. She wanted the men of this country who were creating a new country to try to expand that democracy for women too. Of course, we're not going to do that for more than a century, but we're, like I said in our last lecture, we're making that promise that hopefully someday we will. All right, so now if you're on one side or the other, and of course about a third of the people didn't choose either side and will try to stay out of the war, how were the people treated who were loyalists? Well, if you're in an area of the country like the South where there's a lot of loyalists and you're the majority, you're treated just fine. But if you're in a segment of the country like New England, where there's a lot of patriots and you're in the minority as a loyalist, you're going to be harassed, right? The Sons of Liberty may knock on your door and say, support the cause. And if you don't, maybe they'll burn your house down. Maybe they'll kick you out of the house. Maybe they'll tar and feather you. Maybe they'll destroy your business or make sure people don't support your business. So there's lots of harassment of the loyalists by the patriots. They also may take your home or take your farm and say, look, you forfeited the right to this home and farm, and we're going to give it to a patriot. And so there's real hardship going on because the revolution is almost like a civil war. It's tearing Americans apart. Which side are you on? So here we see a loyalist. He's being ridden out on a rail. He's being ridden out of town on maybe a piece of fence or something, and his hands are tied, and people may throw things at him and insult him, and he's just lost his whole home and business and property and money because these patriots say, you're not with us, you're against us, right? So a lot of loyalists deciding to escape this harassment fled to Canada. Now there are British colonies in Canada who have decided not to join the rebellion, and so they stay loyal to England. And so there's a safe place to go because it's mostly loyalists. A lot of loyalists either from there or outright will just leave for England. Maybe they have friends and family still back in England. And so estimates are about 180,000 people or so, which is a significant part of the population of about 2.5 million at this time, will leave. At the end of the war, there's some hope that they're going to get their property back, their homes, their businesses. England's going to try to make this a part of the peace treaty at the end, and we'll see how that works out for the loyalists. And then the last group I think we're going to talk about for loyalists is some decide to stay and fight, either joining the British Army or acting as spies. There were spies on both sides, especially women, because nobody's going to suspect, men will not suspect women of being duplicitous and being a spy. And so both sides have women act as spies too, supporting the war in this way for either side they're on. All right, so let's now talk about fighting the war itself. So, number one, it says American forces. As we remember from the last lecture, the Americans have a continental army that is going to be the best trained, but it's usually pretty small, and they're not very well supplied. And a lot of times, the bulk of the fighting forces are coming from the militia. These are men that are not, they're just farmers, right? They're not well trained, they're not well equipped. And so we kind of have these two forces in the American army. And so the Continental Congress, right, the Second Continental Congress, they appoint George Washington as the military leader because he's had some experience. If you remember during the French and Indian War, he had experience leading the army. It says some continental troops, but mostly state militia. And that's what we've really already talked about, right? Is that the army was made up of kind of a core of trained men in the Continental Army, and then we had all these periphery auxiliary units that were in the militia. And if you look here, they don't even have uniforms. This is what they might have worn as a farmer, and they grab their musket, and they grab some ammunition, and they go and fight, and sometimes they're in the army for 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, and then they go back home. And so for George Washington, it was always really difficult because his army was always being turned over, right? He didn't know how many troops he would have, if these guys were going to go home. There are all these these letters and these documents of him begging and pleading with the troops to stay, trying to encourage them with ideas of the Enlightenment and you're fighting for your country and freedom. And it was always kind of this shifting thing, trying to keep his army together as they fall away like sand on a beach. Right, poorly trained we talk about. Now, since there is no government at this point uniting the colonies, they just have the Second Continental Congress, which is just a meeting, it's not a government. They can't raise taxes, and so they're infrequently paid. And when they are paid, the troops, they're paid with what we call continentals, which are it's paper money that the Second Continental Congress printed, but they have no authority to print it, and there's nothing to back it up. So it's really worthless money. And so if you're a soldier, you either don't get paid or you get paid in these continentals, which can't buy anything. And so their morale is pretty low, and we see people deserting all the time or just leaving. They're not well fed. And if you're trying to fight for your country and they're not appreciating you and they're not feeding you, and in the wintertime you have no shoes, and in the summertime, you don't have it's hot and it's humid and it's rainy and it's miserable, and you keep losing battles, because we will lose a lot of battles, you just get discouraged. Your wife may be writing you letters, please come home, the children are sick, I can't pay the rent, whatever. So there's a lot of things pulling the troops back home. And so it becomes very difficult. Now, of course, they're facing trained, professional British soldiers that are well-equipped, well-fed, well-trained. They have quarters that they stay in throughout the winter, not out in the countryside like the colonists do. And so in many battles of the Revolution, the British win because they just have better leaders and they're better trained. Here, what we see is the brilliance of George Washington. And so this is something you should know, is that George Washington did not win a lot of battles. He wasn't a military genius. There are several mistakes he made. New York, the Battle of New York, one of them, but his genius was, if not on the battlefield, it was behind the scenes. He was able to inspire men to keep these men who wanted to go back home, who weren't getting paid, who weren't getting fed, to stick with it, to stay together, somehow keep an army together to continue the fight. And even if we lose this battle or the next battle or the next battle, somehow inspire the men to stay together and to train them and to see it through. And really, this is how we win the revolution in part, is that we just outlast the British. We're outmanned, and so we have to outlast them. And eventually, the British, as the war is going on, as we'll see, they just give up. They have other things around the world going on, and other commitments, other wars, and George just helps us kind of get through that time. Right. Valley Forge is a great example of this. In the winter of 1777, we see that the British have decided to bivouac for the winter in these nice warm homes in Philadelphia, but the colonists don't have that. They're out in this valley in Pennsylvania where they have to build their own homes. They're running low on supplies. They don't have enough blankets. They don't have enough food. They don't have enough shoes. And so every morning, as the roll call is taken, George Washington sees his army just dwindle, right? Either because of desertion or death or starvation or freezing to death. And it's really the low point in many ways for the American Revolution. But again, the leadership of George Washington is somehow able to inspire these men to stay together, to keep in the military, to fight another day, to fight another year. All right, financial support. Now, we know that you can't keep this going forever. And so George Washington pleads with the Second Continental Congress, give me some money, give me some troops, we're out of gunpowder, we need muskets. And so what happens is the Second Continental Congress will send ambassadors to France and to Spain and to the Netherlands, and they're able to get some support, especially from France. And so kind of behind the scenes, France is starting to send the United States money, the colonies, I should say. And they have to do it kind of on the down low. They have to do it quietly, because if England finds out that they're openly helping England's colonies rebel, then England will declare war on France, and France isn't quite ready for that yet. And they certainly don't want to get dragged into a war if the colonies are going to lose, and then they're going to be fighting England on her own. And so the French are giving us weapons and money and supplies, but kind of secretly, they're smuggling them in. And so this is helping us too. This is another reason the Americans are eventually going to win the war, is because the French are going to provide us aid. All right, Saratoga. So this is one of the key battles that we're going to talk about. Saratoga is right up here. This is the Hudson River, right? And it is symbolically the separation between the core of the revolution, New England, and the rest of the colonies over here. And so the British decide, right, if we can kind of isolate New England, and really focus our attacks on New England, then maybe we can cut the head off of this snake, right? Maybe we can isolate the people that are leading this revolution, and the other colonies will see the folly of this war and just quit. And so we can't let that happen. If we're Americans, we can't let the New England colonies be separated from the other colonies. And so we launch an invasion up here, right? And we go up here and pass north of Albany, and we attack the British Army at a place called Saratoga. We surround them deep in the woods. And we're able to this is the first real victory that we see, significant victory that we see at this time for the Americans. And the British have to surrender to the Americans. And this is a huge morale boost for the Americans, but it plays another important role, is that the French were covertly aiding us at this time. But now that we've seen that the Americans can defeat the British in battle, right, toe to toe, as we did at Saratoga, that maybe the Americans have a chance of winning this war. And so the French feel more inclined now to openly support the Americans, to make a treaty of alliance with us. And so now France joins the war, which means the war is not just in America anymore, but now the war is in Europe too. And this really helps us out because the French can openly send us troops and supplies and money. And so now, instead of a trickle of money and supplies that comes in, we're getting all of these French troops and supplies coming in, boatload. And also it's going to distract England back in Europe. Now England has to worry about protecting the homeland. And so England can't send as many troops to the colonies to put down the rebellion because they're dealing with a war in Europe as well as in the colonies. And so this is really going to help us be a major factor for winning the war. All right, so now we fast forward. Obviously, we're skipping a lot of battles here because really, we're interested in the pivotal events of the war and then the outcome of the war. And so, of course, the next major battle we're going to talk about is at Yorktown in 1781. So by 1781, the French have sent an army to America. And so George is working hand in hand with the French army to try to defeat the British. In addition to that, the French Navy is also entered because we didn't have much of a navy at all. We had a small one, but not much one of all to stand up to the British. And so this is how it works. So at Yorktown, the British, what they had under Lord Cornwallis, he's the British soldier. You can see him right here. Well, okay, that's not him. We'll talk about that in a second, sorry. So Lord Cornwallis, he is wreaking havoc in the South, and he wants to get resupplied. And so he worked out a deal with the British Navy that he is going to meet the British Navy here at Yorktown. Now, if we could do a close-up of Yorktown, here's the water, right? Yorktown is on this peninsula that sticks out into the ocean. And so Lord Cornwallis is here, and he is supposed to get resupplied by the British Navy, as you see right here. But unbeknownst to Lord Cornwallis, the French Navy under de Grasse, they come up and they fight a pitched battle on the sea, and the French drive off the British fleet. Now, Cornwallis doesn't know this, and so when ships arrive, he thinks they're British ships to resupply him, but lo and behold, they're not British ships, they're French ships. And so Lord Cornwallis is on this peninsula where the French can just bombard him, and so he's like, oh shoot, not only going to get supplies, but I'm going to get bombarded, so I better get off this peninsula so I just don't get blown up. But now George Washington kind of completes the trap. He and the French military kind of block the British on this peninsula, and so the British have nowhere to go. And so this is the Battle of Yorktown. This is the major army that the British have in the colonies, and eventually they're trapped by land, they're trapped by sea, and Lord Cornwallis has to surrender his sword, and he gives up. And this is a huge victory for the colonists because it is a defeat of the British major army in the colonies. And so, for all intents and purposes, the war for America ends in 1781. Now, there'll be some sporadic fighting from 1782 to 1783, but there isn't an immediate end to the war because we have a treaty of alliance with France, right? The French said when they joined us that neither one of us is going to end the war until both of us agree. The French were very concerned that if the Americans just withdraw, then they'd fight the British on their own, and we felt the same way. And so even though the fighting is kind of over in the colonies, it's still going on in Europe, and so Americans don't end the war. They just kind of say, okay, we're with you, France. We can't really do a lot to help France at this point, but that's why the war is not going to end until 1783. All right, so now let's talk about peace. It says the British people are ready for an end to the war. So as this war is dragging on, and it is a world war now, it's not just happening in the colonies, but as we said, it's happening in Europe. And of course, the French and the British have colonies all around the world, in the Caribbean, in Asia. And so this has spread around the world, and it's really adding up. And if you remember, going into this war, the English were in debt. That was one of the major causes of this war. And so the British people are sick to death of this war, right? The economy is getting ruined, and the British are losing battles all around the world, and it's just never ending. And so there's lots of pressure back in England on Parliament to end this war now. And so we had said here the British suffer losses in the West Indies, Europe, and India. The British merchants are also losing money because their number one customer was the American colonies. And they haven't been able to trade with the American colonies because the British government has put up a blockade around the American colonies to harm America. All right, we figure if America, we don't want any, gunpowder or guns or supplies getting into the Americans that they could turn around and use against Britain's own troops. And so, this was kind of economic warfare. The British were trying to, grind the Americans economically into submission. But unintended consequence, it's also really harming the economy of England because English merchants have big business contracts in the American colonies and now they can't get any money. So goods are piling up on the docks of London. And so the very influential and powerful British merchant back in England put pressure on Parliament, end this war now so we can get back to trading, right? So with all of this going on, they have elections in England, and a new leader comes to the forefront in Parliament, a new prime minister. His name is Lord North, and for all of these reasons, he decided we're going to end this war. He also is a liberal. It's a party that's called the Whigs. Back in England, and these people believe in the Enlightenment, and they want to really limit the power of the king. And they see that this was really just a war for the king. It wasn't really helping the people of England. In fact, it's hurting the people of England. And so they decide that they are going to end this war, and they're in power now in Parliament. And they're very sympathetic with the colonists because, the Whigs back in England say for limited government, less power to the king, freedom, democracy, liberty, and that's exactly what the colonists are fighting for. So they see some common ground here. And so we see that England pushes for peace. Now, in 1783, what happens is that there are three major parties in this war. We have the French, we have the colonists, and we have the British. And we surprised our French allies by signing this peace treaty without them. France was like, what did you guys do? Because France is winning this war right now, and they don't want the war to end. But the Americans are like, well, if the war could be over, that would be great. We could get on the business of starting our country. And so without asking the French, we go ahead and sign a peace treaty with the British, kind of stabbing the French in the back a little bit here for us. But it's what's best for us, and all's fair in love and war, I guess. And so we sign a treaty with England, and of course England wants to do this because now they can focus their attention on defeating the French back in Europe and the other places of the world. And so as part of the Treaty of Paris, the United States becomes the United States. England says, we know you're no longer our colonies, and now you're an independent country. So of course that's the most important outcome of the Treaty of Paris. Next, America, of course, is going to gain not only all the land of the original 13 colonies, now we'll call them states, but also all this land west of the Appalachians to the Mississippi River. This was all given to England after the French and Indian War from France, and now as part of the deal, we get it. The United States gets it. Now, why would England do this? Well, because England is desperate to end this war with the Americans because they want to focus on the French. And so this now, everything in green now is the size of the new United States of America. Next, England promises, so if you remember, after the French and Indian War, England took over some of these forts out west. They used to be French trading forts, and England wanted to get in the fur trade. So England has people in these forts engaging with trade with the Indians, with fur trade with the Indians, the natives. And so as part of this treaty, this is now U.S. territory, and so England's like, you're right, we should get out of those forts. Now they don't, by the way, and that's going to lead us to another war called the War of 1812. But we think they're going to get out of those forts at this point. Right. Now, the Americans promised that we will return all of that property we took from the Loyalists. England is like, you guys were not fair to our loyal citizens. They should be able to be free to return or at least get some of their money and businesses back. And we say, okay, that seems fair, we'll do it. We don't, as a matter of fact, which of course will help lead to another war, like I said, the War of 1812. So even though the Treaty of Paris ends this war, there's going to be some unresolved issues between us and the British. Right? It says, Americans, we also promise that we will repay our debts to British merchants. Remember we had said that the American, especially the plantation owners, owed a lot of money to British merchants, and that was one of the reasons they joined the Revolution. Well, they're not going to be happy about this. And so as the war comes to a close, the British merchants are an important political force in England, and so they make them put that in the treaty, and we're like, sure, we'll do that. But we don't actually make our plantation owners pay back those debts. So that's another kind of unresolved issue that'll lead to the War of 1812. All right, and just a note here, let's talk now about the Native Americans, because the Native Americans live out here in the Ohio River Valley and then also in the Southwest. And if you remember, right after the French and Indian War, when England got this land, they passed the Proclamation of 1763 to protect this area for Native Americans. And it's not like they cared about the Native Americans necessarily. It's because they wanted the Native Americans to be free of colonists and be able to continue to trade fur, so that the English could get rich. Well, during the Revolution, a lot of Native Americans will side with the British. Because they see that it's in their interest that if the British maintain their hold of the colonies, they can keep the colonists east of the Appalachian Mountains and not invade their territory. In fact, there's a Native American called Chief Little Turtle who will rally the Native Americans to his cause and try to side with the British and keep the Americans east of those Appalachian Mountains. And so the American Revolution is not going to end well for the Native Americans west of the Appalachian Mountains, because now that this territory is ours, the United States is, we are going to flood over those Appalachian Mountains, and we are going to wage war on the natives in that region. Right. Now we have our last section. It says Impact of the Revolution Abroad. France, 1789. And so the American Revolution is going to have what we call ripple effects, right? Because of the spirit of 1776, we say we're fighting for freedom, democracy, equality, Enlightenment ideas, is that the French government is going to be very much in debt after the American Revolution. And if you remember, the French loaned the United States a bunch of money and troops and aid to win our revolution. And when the war is over, the United States does not pay them back. We're going to talk about why in more detail later. It's basically because we have a country that's too weak and a government that's too weak to pay them back. And so the French government is in a dire strait here. They're like, oh my gosh, we have no money. And so the French king starts raising taxes on his own people because they're so far in debt from the American Revolution. Now the people of France were like, you cannot do this. We've seen what the Americans did. When the king tried to raise taxes on them, we rebelled. And so we're going to do the same thing because the Enlightenment is still going on strong in Europe, and they're inspired by the American Revolution, and it's kind of caused by the American Revolution because that's why the king was raising taxes that people got upset about anyway. And so we see that the French have this all-out revolution where the people rise up. They take oaths, as we see in the bottom left picture, that we're going to reform our government, we're going to have democracy, we're going to have elected representatives, Enlightenment ideas, just like the American Revolution, and they overthrow their king, and eventually they kill their king, as we can see in this picture. They chop the king's head off. And so we see that it's somewhat reminiscent of the American Revolution, as it's caused by taxes. The people are inspired by the Enlightenment Revolution, the Enlightenment words, and they rise up and overthrow. And so there's some connection here between the American Revolution and the French Revolution. Now, eventually, the French Revolution will get way out of control. The people rise up and they start killing all the rich people, which is not what happens in America. It becomes more of a class warfare. And there's this dictator that takes over in all of this chaos. His name is Napoleon. And the reason I bring this bit of French history up is because there's going to be another round of wars in Europe not too long after the American Revolution is over. And we'll see that Napoleon is going to try to take over Europe, and England and France are going to fight again. And in the future, America is going to have to decide if we want to honor our Treaty of Alliance with the French, who are once again at war with England, or if we should stay out. And that is going to embroil the presidencies of Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and Madison. And so events in Europe are kind of inspired by events in America and then kind of rebound back and forth across the Atlantic. More about that in future lectures. Another revolution that is inspired by the American Revolution is the Haitian Revolution. So in 1791 to 1804, after the American Revolution, the slave population and the free African American population of Haiti will rise up in rebellion. Now, this is connected to the American Revolution because when France sent troops to help the Americans fight against our king, a lot of the troops they sent were these Haitian troops that they raised from Haiti, these Africans who were former slaves who, the French employed and sent over to America or sometimes dragged over to America. And so while these Africans from Haiti were fighting the revolution and helping us out, they talked to American soldiers, they heard about the spirit of 76, and they were inspired by it. And so when the war is over and these Haitians go back to Haiti, they start talking about their military experiences and freedom and democracy and liberty, and like, why don't we have that here? Why are the white people in charge of everything? And we are either slaves or free people, but free people without any money or land. And so they yes, let's do that here. And so it's another example of an Enlightenment revolution where it's inspired by freedom, democracy, equality, and the people who fight in it were trained by the French in the Americas and then come back and make the core of what will be the slave rebellion's troops. And so we see in a very much more direct way the Haitian Revolution is tied to the American Revolution. Here's Toussaint Louverture. He is going to be the jeune de couleur, which means the free people of color, who is going to lead not only the other jeune de couleurs but the slaves in a massive uprising against the white population and take it over. And this is the only successful slave rebellion in all of the Americas here in Haiti. And so they set up a republic and a democracy. And again, like I said, it's inspired by the American Revolution. It says here, France distracted by the Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. This goes on not too long after the American Revolution, and when Napoleon is taken over and he's conquering Europe, the French are distracted by what's going on in Europe, and so this is the perfect time for the slaves and the jeune de couleurs, the free people of color, to rebel because France is distracted. And so it's really just perfect timing here. And again, we see these movements and events going on back and forth across the Atlantic, impacting one another. All right, so that's our learning objectives. So number 5, it says, analyze how the leadership of George Washington wins the revolution. And we talked about he is really inspirational. He is able to keep the troops inspired, keep the army together when they're out of supplies and food and money. And he through his inspiration, is able to keep the military together. The military helped to win the revolution because, their bravery, but also they're fighting for their Enlightenment rights. They're inspired to fight for their freedom. That's something tangible, something that you can definitely come out the better of if you keep it, and democracy and liberty. And of course, the last part here, we couldn't have done it without the French supplying not just money, but actual troops and a navy to help us finally defeat the British. Number 6, to what extent did the ideals of the revolution change the view of women? And we said it did to some extent. We said that women, except in the state of New Jersey, women are not going to get the right to vote and they're not going to get equality, but at least they're getting recognition. Now, they're at least getting recognition for being moms, the important role that being a mother plays of raising sons to be good, moral citizens in our new democracy. Number 7, describe who supported and opposed the revolution and why. And we had talked about the Patriots and who they were, and the Loyalists or Tories and who they were, and why each side chose the way they did. And we also talked about the big segment of the population that tried to sit it out one way or the other, not join either side. Number 8, analyze the impact of the revolution on other parts of the world, and especially we talked about its impact on the French Revolution and the Haitian Revolution, and how those Enlightenment ideas are going to spread, how the French were in debt because of the American Revolution, and that's going to cause their king to raise taxes, which is going to inspire their people to rebel. And so here we have the 8 essential questions or learning objectives of this lecture.